I think that the pathology space and building tools for this is just incredibly rewarding. And the thing that I like too about this space is there's infinite levels of complexity. I mean, there's a lot of complexity in horticulture, but like there's just never ending amounts of questions and nuances and details that you can chase in this space. So
Hmm.
I just find that very engaging, right? After 10 years, I still don't know nearly as much as I could about the space. And I can learn something new every day without really even like digging that hard. I think that's really cool. That's something that's really cool about pathology and laboratory medicine.
Welcome to the People of Pathology podcast. I'm Dennis Strang. On this podcast, we explore pathology one story at a time and connect with the people behind the diagnosis. Sometimes the greatest innovations come from outside a field. Today's guest is Alex Bodell, the CTO of Formapath. Alex isn't a pathologist or a pathologist assistant. He's a mechanical engineer whose career just happened to bring him to pathology. We'll talk about how a chance project introduced him to pathology and how that eventually led to Formapath. And we'll discuss the nToto device and why he believes robotics and AI could transform tissue grossing. All right, let's get into it with Alex Bodell. Alex, thanks for being here with me today. This will be a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, very much appreciate the opportunity.
So the place I want to start, to get some context about you, I want to start with your background. So you're a mechanical engineer. Can you tell me, how did you get interested in that field?
I grew up loving to build stuff, and both my parents are scientists, which probably also tags into why I became interested in pathology. But when I went to college, I didn't actually know, and my parents didn't actually know any engineers. And the hunch that I had was I like to build things, and mechanical engineering would probably be, just based on the course descriptions, the best selection. So I applied on a hunch and on a whim, and it turned out to be the right fit. It really lined up with what I was actually interested in.
Okay, that's interesting. It sounds kind of, I guess, a little bit vague. Like, I like to build things, and so I'm going to do this. Like,
I grew up with a wood shop,
okay,
and it was building skate ramps and working on boats and a lot of stuff mechanical, working on cars. So it really was just built out of this kind of general catch-all enthusiasm for hands-on construction. And I remember as a kid, Saturdays, my parents would take me down to the lumber yard, and they had a scrap bin. And so they would let me fill the station wagon up with as much wood as could fit in there that they had for the offcuts. And we just build all sorts of crazy stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's tough when you don't have actual context with people who are engineers, right? When you're a kid, you know what your parents do and maybe what their friends or other family do. But I really didn't have a connection to engineering outside of having it being described to me as maybe what it would lead to. So I really just took my love for woodworking and using my hands to create stuff and went for it. And it really did end up pretty well describing and matching what my interests are.
okay. I love that you kind of created your own path. That's cool. So some of your early work in engineering was in vertical farms. Can you tell me about this? First of all, what does that even mean? What's a vertical farm?
Yeah, well, a vertical farm is really a part of controlled environment agriculture. So the idea of growing crops in, whether it's a greenhouse, whether it's a warehouse, a container, but in a way where you can actually have control of the elements. It's not just in the field where you're relying on the sun and the ambient temperature. And so I got into that post college. I started working on architectural lighting, and it was a project that was converting incandescent fixtures, so your typical light bulbs, to LEDs. LEDs were just coming onto the scene, and there was a manufacturing design project for how do we do these conversions, and then how do we manufacture these new products. So I got into that, and that led to this field of horticulture where there was a lot of interest in using these specialized LEDs to try to optimize the photosynthesis for plants. So the general concept was, can we use LEDs and can we control the environment so that we can grow crops faster? We can grow them in unique locations, like let's say warehouses that aren't being used right now around city centers? Can we basically combine technology and start growing stuff in new and unique ways? And so the vertical farm was born out of that, where once you start saying, hey, we're going to grow indoors, we're going to use these lighting sources to do that, we can start stacking stuff on top of each other, hence the kind of term vertical farm. And it was a really interesting field, and it was a really great mission driven field, right? People were creating technology to give people food security and food access for all sorts of different situations. The hook and challenge that I ran into in the career and working on it, I worked on it for about a decade, was that when you went to actually commercialize crops that were being grown out of vertical farms, you couldn't charge $12 for a clamshell of lettuce just because it was grown with an LED, right? There was unit economics, and people would tolerate some amount of price discrepancy from, let's say, like a field grown crop. They thought it was cool, local, sustainable. But when you looked at the amount and the cost of capital equipment that went into that space to really grow those crops, unless there was grants involved or there's some other type of subsidy, it's really hard to sell those crops at a price that could compete with conventional crops. And so it was a really interesting field. I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about bringing new technology into spaces where it's historically been done by hand, right? People growing crops in the field. But ultimately, I found a path out of that when I think a lot of the work that we were doing, we were really butting up against just the economic realities of selling those crops.
Okay, so this kind of sounds unrelated completely from pathology, but when we get into what you're doing now, I think it's going to become related because, first of all, you're doing things in a kind of a non-conventional way, right? And but also it's a lot of like thinking outside the box and taking this is the way we've always done it and kind of turning it on its head, right?
Totally,
Yeah,
totally. And that's, I think, what's from the outside, that's what's really exciting, but that's also the tension that makes it really hard, right?
sure.
There's a lot of momentum, or there's a lot of inertia for when things are being done the right way to keep doing them and to come in with technology and to say, hey, wait, this is better. Do it this way. Look at it from this angle.
Mhm.
You might have a point, but it's hard to steer the ship in that way. But nonetheless, it's a really exciting thing to work on. And I think that when you get it right, it can be really rewarding.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. All right, so let's keep going along that path then. So, how did your work shift then to healthcare and specifically into pathology?
Well, I had started a design and production studio, and it was to support developing different components for vertical farms. And my co-founder was working in that studio with me, and we got connected to a pathologist, a lab director, who had read an article or been given an article that was published in a German journal around pressing on tissue to express off the adipose fat and help recover more lymph nodes. And this article described a rudimentary kind of tube apparatus that you could load the tissue in and you could press on it, and it would squeeze off all the fat, and the connective tissue and lymph nodes would remain. And yeah, at the time, I didn't really even understand what a lymph node was, but he approached us and said, hey, you guys have some equipment. Can you make a prototype for me? And we did, and we brought it to the lab, and it was just for fun. We had the equipment. Why not? We're engineers, we're having fun. And we brought it to the lab, and they followed the protocol in this journal. And the first thing that happened is just fat sprayed all over the grossing lab. It was, I
I'm like,
mean, very, very messy. But it turned out to essentially work. I mean, they pressed off a bunch of fat, and they got these little lymph node cakes, and they submitted them.
mhm,
And the question that I didn't understand at the time, but what they were trying to figure out and see if was true from the journal was, if you really press down on this tissue really hard and you squeeze it really hard, does it squish the lymph nodes? Like, can you actually preserve the morphology of the lymph nodes by squeezing that hard, or does it just essentially crush everything, which would then render the technique useless for
R-
pathology purposes, right?
Right.
But that was my introduction to the lab, was really the classic setup of engineers having a shop and having capabilities, and someone interested with a problem saying, hey, can you design something for me? And in this case, can you replicate what was described in the journal? And so we did that, and it worked far better than we expected. And this was at the time where, kind of touching on the vertical farm stuff, I was interested in expanding and working on new
Yeah.
projects. And what I loved about it was the North Star in it, right? I mean, healthcare is great because you have the opportunity to, just like growing food, like really help people, right?
Yes.
And so we thought it was just a cool space. I'd never been into a grossing lab before that. It was really interesting to see. It wasn't what I expected. Maybe you had the same experience when you went into your first
Oh, yeah, for
lab,
sure.
right?
Hmm.
I was quite surprised, but it was a very rewarding experience. And it ultimately really created this fascination to say, how can we build this technology for the space? And that's how we got started.
Okay. So that was kind of the formation of Formapath then?
It was, yeah. It started around lymph nodes, believe it or not,
Okay.
and looking for lymph nodes.
And this was, I believe it was called the AdiPress, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. It was a tool called the AdiPress. Exactly.
Okay. That's interesting. So this was what, 2016, I guess?
Yeah. This was about a decade ago, which is crazy to say. But yeah, it
Yeah,
was
it
in
is.
2016. Yeah. So we worked on it. We started in 2016 and we worked on it through 2019. And really, like, the formation of the company and where we got started is we were accepted into the Cedar Sinai Accelerator program in Los Angeles. And we had a tool. We were working with the folks at Cedars to collect the data set using the tool. The co-founders, we moved out to Los Angeles, and that's when we really went all in, and I stopped working on the vertical farm stuff, and we just went full into Formapath.
Do you ever miss the vertical farm work?
There's really awesome people. I miss working with the people for sure. But no, I mean, I think that the pathology space and building tools for this is just incredibly rewarding. And the thing that I like too about this space is there's infinite levels of complexity. I mean, there's a lot of complexity in horticulture, but like, there's just never ending amounts of questions and nuances and details that you can chase in this space. So
Hmm.
I just find that very engaging, right? After 10 years, I still don't know nearly as much as I could about the space. And I can learn something new every day without really even like digging that hard. And I think that's really cool. That's something that's really cool about pathology and laboratory medicine.
I can tell you after 20 years, I learn new things just about every day too. So it
Yeah,
never ends.
it's incredible. And there's so many layers to it, right? It's not just the incoming technology and how that changes stuff,
Right.
but it's just research and just
Yes.
discovery, pharma. Like, why are you doing this? What is the downstream benefit? How can this tissue be used in new and novel ways that you weren't even tracking a year ago?
Right. Yeah. There's so much of that. Okay. So I want to get into the newest product from Formapath. So this is called
Yeah,
nToto,
correct.
which, as far as I know, this is the first time robotics has been applied to grossing tissue.
Yeah,
Can you
I
take me to,
certainly, that's certainly what we see. Yeah.
okay, what's the beginning of this? Like, how did this idea come up?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the basis is really the story. Getting to the AdiPress is important because what that did was let myself and let people in the company really spend some time in labs and actually see how they operate,
Okay.
right? I think a classic challenge for engineers is when you are looking on the outside at a space and you see opportunities where you see improvements, but you're not necessarily, in this case, at the bench level, actually working with PAs or grossing techs, et cetera, right? Like,
Mhm.
what you think is a good idea or what you think will fly in terms of a new piece of technology or how it works doesn't necessarily actually match up with people's day-to-day realities and lives, right?
Sure.
And so the AdiPress got me into the lab, and the thing that I noticed was for every large specimen that we were working on for dissecting lymph nodes, there was 20, 50 small specimen jars sitting there,
Sure. Yeah.
right? And um, for a path, is a company, and the way that we've been supported to date, right, is through investment. And kind of part of that side of the company is you have to have a market opportunity that really warrants enough investment where you can raise enough capital to really have a good chance at commercialization and success on the market, right? And the AdiPress is a great niche product. It has a great market, has a great application, and we still do work with that product. But what became clear to me was that these small biopsies, Matt, a majority of the work that's actually passing through the grossing lab. And so what happened is in 2020, COVID,
Right.
and we stopped going into labs. And so what I started doing was really digging into the research and specifically the lab economics. That was something that I was weak on and really didn't understand. I didn't really understand billing. I didn't really understand the nuances of the different steps going into histology and the cost basis for those, et cetera. And what became just glaringly obvious to me was having a solution that was targeted at small biopsies really represented a bulk majority of the work and the market for grossing, right? And so that was the kind of like market need and the opportunity that I saw, right? Chasing that tissue specimen. But then it came down to, well, how do we actually like create something? So I was interested in thinking about automation, thinking about how the Clin Lab is doing their work and what types of tools and techniques that we can bring in to higher levels of automation to the bench. And through that work and through the research that I was just describing, again, COVID, I was emailing people interested in just collaborations. And I emailed some folks at Mayo Clinic in Rochester. And I ended up linking up with Dr. Joaquin Garcia. And there was pretty immediately a direct shared interest around, hey, what happens if we could do this kind of full automation around biopsy grossing, right? And their department had an initiative going on looking at lab of the future and a lot of interest and focus on digital pathology and what happens once you get to the slide. And I think very smartly, he had identified saying, hey, we need to look upstream to the other processes and we need
Okay.
to see how tools and technology can really benefit those processes. So having the work been done around grossing, that's really where I felt like I had a lot of domain expertise just from the AdiPress. And we had basically started collaborating and discussing, could there be an opportunity to replicate grossing, but doing it with robotics and the robotic arm and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And really with the idea of creating a truly hands-free process, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to link the video in the show notes to this, but I've watched
Cool.
the demo video a few times now, and I've showed it to everyone that I work with. The arm, it mimics, like, if I'm grossing these biopsy specimens, the arm does the things that my arms do, right? Swirling the
Yeah.
container, dumping it
Yeah.
over, like, so tell me about the research that went into developing those motion.
Yeah. It's funny because you watch the video and you're right. I mean, that motion came from standing in a grossing room and just observing lab techs doing their transfer, right?
Okay.
And so what became really clear early on, and like one of the challenges was we wanted to get the specimens from the cup to the cassette reliably,
Yep.
right? And we didn't want to have a contact surface. So we didn't want to introduce an additional consumable. And we didn't want to use, let's say, like a funnel where you would have a risk of cross contamination, right?
Okay.
So what was pretty clear was that robotics could be like pretty precise for repeatable motion. But the challenge we're having was how do you actually ensure that you dislodge the tissue that's settled down at the bottom of the cup, actually kind of get it up into the fluid so that when you do the transfer, you get it all out of the cup.
Mhm.
And we worked on it for about a year. There was a lot of concepts that went into it. And ultimately we moved from a kind of like a 2D robotic setup, which was simpler, but just didn't have the nuance that you could program with the arm. And what we discovered was like, watching the swirl motions and like seeing how that's done, there was a real science to that. I mean, people had figured out naturally the right way to get the biopsies into suspension in the fluid. And then if you watched how they would transfer when they would pour the cup, it wasn't just a dump, right? If you pour it too fast at the beginning, too much fluid comes out. But as less fluids in the cup and you're like through your pouring motion, there would be this kind of final wrist flick to really get the remaining fluid out.
Yeah.
And that was really the trick to really, in a very consistent way, get all the biopsies out of the cup and into the cassette. So, I mean, it was just merging available technology with techniques that people have perfected.
Okay. Okay. And even like, I was showing this to someone and the arm did the pour and then they're like, how do they know if they got all the tissue out of it? And I'm like, just watch. And it does the rinse and it pours
Yeah.
again. Like they thought of
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah. Well, and even beyond that, the way that we really confirm it, and it's been a really fascinating process, is we use a optical technique where we shine 365 nanometer UV light into the cup,
Okay.
and it causes any residual tissue to fluoresce green. And what's interesting about it is, so if you're using normal visual techniques, it's really hard to distinguish between a water droplet in the bottom of the cup and a bit of tissue, right?
Yeah.
And especially if you kind of look at the details, these specimen jars are not designed for image and optic detection. They're designed to be specimen jars. So they have all these mold lines that are good for creating the thing, but are not very good for like trying to image small fragments of tissue that are settled into the bottom cracks of the cup. And so those mold lines in conjunction with water droplets make it very difficult to look in the cup for small fragments, and using a camera say, oh, hey, one's there. Using this fluorescence technique, you can basically get it to glow green. You take the image, and if there's a small fragment in there, we can basically flag that and either do the rinse down again, or we can even put the cap back on, put that jar to the side so that someone at the bench can confirm, hey, we really got all the tissue out of this cup.
Okay. Two things about that. How did you figure out to use the UV light to do that?
I can't take credit for that.
Okay.
So that was someone on the team. I mean, right? I think like as the team grows, part of my job is to hire people that are more creative and have seen more things than me and can bring some really cool ideas to the table. So that fluorescence idea came from someone on the team. And the way that we initially tested it was we bought $5 UV flashlights on Amazon and just shine them in the cup. And that's actually
Oh,
something that I say to people, like, buy the $5 USB charge flashlights on Amazon. And when you're grossing as a spot check, just flip the light into the cup. And it's pretty surprising, especially for very translucent
okay.
small fragments on the inner rings of those cups. Like when we're in our shop using contrived samples and doing testing, I'll look in a cup and say, oh, it's empty. Shine the flashlight in it. Boom. There's a piece of tissue in there.
I'm going to try this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's pretty cool. I would, not to take away what the nToto can do, but you can also, if you want to use the flashlight, you can definitely do that.
Okay. And then the other question related to that, you were talking about if there is a piece of tissue that's left over, or like, what does the machine do if there's tissue in the lid? Because I know you image that too.
Yeah. Yeah. So same technique. Idea is to recap and put it into exclusion, put it to the side. And I think that this gets to this kind of parallel conversation where I'm describing watching people and then replicating it with robots, which kind of takes it in a certain direction. But the truth is, when you look at this technology, you still need people who are qualified and trained to be able to look at tissue. Hey, a polyp was submitted and it's too big to entirely submit,
Yeah.
and it needs to be bisected or dissected, right?
Right.
And part of the nToto process is to be able to flag that, take it off the full automation line, put it to the side, let someone do the correct work up on the specimen and then put it right back into histology. So it's not a replacement solution. It's much more of an interplay where it's really good at doing entirely submitted small fragments,
Right.
but then there's been a lot of work put into it where when it identifies various edge cases, and there's a lot of edge cases, as you can imagine, it kicks it offline and lets someone finish the case or use their expertise to decide what to do next.
Okay, I see. That makes sense. There was a big question that I had as far as what does it do if there's a problem? Yeah.
Yeah, exclusion, and it flags it and it puts it there's like a dedicated zone to it. And today that's all held within the nToto box, but you can even imagine where as these labs move even more towards the clinical lab setup where there's more dedicated transport infrastructure in histology engrossing, that it's like basically it's like a conveyor line where you have these offshoots where the nToto sits at one section of grossing,
Mhm.
and when things pass through that aren't meant to really go through that process, they're automatically diverted onto a different track that runs to a bench where people are using their techniques to dissect or do whatever else is needed to properly get the tissue into histology.
Okay. Okay. I like that. This is the People of Pathology podcast with our guest, Alex Bodell from Formapath. We'll be right back. When it comes to cancer staging, one of the most important parts is finding all of the lymph nodes. I should know. It's what I do every day. Yet this process has remained the same for over 100 years, manual, tedious, and time-consuming. That's a problem because every missed lymph node can mean inaccurate cancer staging. That's about to change. Enter InVision from Cision Vision, a first-of-its-kind device that's redefining the standard of care. Traditionally, we identify lymph nodes by sight and feel alone. InVision changes that using short-wave infrared technology to make lymph nodes stand out clearly from surrounding fat and in real time. In its first 104-patient study published in the Journal of Clinical Pathology, InVision helped increase lymph node counts in 86% of cases and even upstage 4% of patients from N0 to N1. I personally contributed to the study, and let me tell you, seeing the technology's impact firsthand was amazing. It's time to invest in grossing innovations that improve patient care. So, how is your lab approaching innovation in grossing? Book a demo at demo.cisionvision.com and start seeing lymph nodes like never before. Are you thinking about applying to a pathologist assistance program and feeling a little lost? That's why I created the Path to PathA, your PA school application blueprint. This is a step-by-step prep course that gives you everything you need for a strong application. From finding shadowing to writing a standout personal statement to prepping for interviews, this course was made to help you feel informed, confident, and ready. Visit www.thepathtopatha.com to join the mailing list. You'll be the first to hear when the course launches. Your path starts here. Now for the rest of my conversation with Alex Bodell on the People of Pathology podcast. Now, you said you were working with Mayo initially, so they wanted the nToto. But
Yeah.
now, when we're talking to other people about it, what sort of feedback or kind of reaction do you get from them? Because I talk about bringing technology into grossing a lot, and
Yeah.
sometimes people are like, we don't need it. And like even with the
Yeah.
nToto, I can gross biopsies faster than that. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
what kind of reactions did you get bringing in this technology?
Yeah. I mean, so have I heard I can gross faster than nToto?
Right.
Absolutely. Right. And so it's like kind of this, I mean, that's like a fun challenge for us is to always like speed up our cycle time and try to make it move faster.
Right.
Right. But I also think, I mean, I've definitely seen this like pre and post COVID. When we talk to labs, the number one message that the lab directors and people in the lab give us is we're not hiring enough people. Our specimen volumes are going up, and we're, for example, having PAs grow smalls when we want them on large specimens. So it's not just a labor shortage, but it's also a labor coverage and utilization where it's saying, hey, we have these highly skilled PAs as an example. Should they be doing dump and pours? They can do them and they can probably do them pretty fast. And I think that the reality is in a lot of labs, people have to tap in and just help move the workflow through. But I also think that when people see the process, they say, actually, like letting a machine do that, especially when it's dump and pours and we're not describing really bringing in discretionary technique. We're not really describing a process that I think actually gets at like the bulk of the training
Mm.
for a PA, for example.
Sure. Okay.
Right. And so I think people are pretty comfortable with it. I think that what we saw with the AdiPress is doing lymph node dissection. That's much more in the like PA's domain and has to do with their expertise. And that's a direct comparison. How many lymph nodes can I find on the bench versus pressing out in the fat, right?
Yeah.
For dump and pours, that's like there's a ton of volume. If we can just move these through the lab in an efficient, safe way, I think most people agree it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Okay. I like that. So we've been talking about using the nToto for probably GI biopsy specimens,
Yeah.
right? And that's what it's geared towards right now. I'm curious, is there work being done, research or anything about like expanding the type of specimens that the machine can handle?
Definitely. I mean, the two most common questions we get is, does it do derm and can we do cores?
Okay.
And I think where we sit today, coming back to the challenges and work needed for commercialization and really bringing in new and novel technology, my general statement is, hey, if we can just solve GI, right? If you have just enough volume for that, will that help your lab? And I think for most labs that we talk to, there's enough volume just in GI, one jar, one cassette, where the nToto, both from a usefulness perspective, but also from an ROI and economics perspective, makes
Yeah.
sense. And we don't have to get into expanding the use case and the complication of the technology. And I mean, certainly the challenge with derm is orientation, right?
Yep.
Like, how do you determine and set orientation? I have thoughts on that. I think it's a really great question, but it also it certainly further complicates both the technology, but then also the validation of the technology.
Interesting. Okay. Now, like I said before, talking about bringing technology to grossing, the future of grossing, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm a PA, right? That's what I do. This is super interesting to me. For you, looking ahead 10 years,
Yeah.
what do you think that future is going to look like, incorporating the nToto and anything else that you might invent in the near future?
Yeah. I certainly think that there, especially for high volume, simple specimens like
Mhm.
GI, that we are going to see end-to-end automation, right? I think that we will for sure in the next decade have processes. They'll probably be more specimen specific, but jar comes in, digital slide comes out, right?
Mhm.
And maybe there's even digital staining going on. I mean, there's all sorts of like even cool like nuances that like sit in that entire
Yeah.
workflow. But I think that it's going to largely look like a clin lab where specimen in, result out, and minimal intervention by a person in between the process. The other part that I'm massively fascinated in is AI and how it will evolve really past the slide and actually move up into the lab. I always found the work being done in AI very fascinating for diagnosis and discovery purposes.
Yeah.
But I have to say truthfully, not being an AI company ourselves and not having any experience in that development, I didn't have any I had never used it. I'd only seen pictures of it, right? Or read posts or read articles about it, but I had no hands-on experience. And that's obviously changed, I think, for all of us with ChatGPT, Claude, et cetera.
Yeah.
And just to look at our workflow last summer versus this summer, last summer, we were doing code development where models were starting to get integrated into our software to help with programming and that kind of stuff. And it was very fascinating. I mean, now our workflow across the company is all based around AI platforms. And it really expanded my mind in terms of like what's possible. And it really gave me an appreciation for what these AI companies in pathology developed. I didn't really get it. I just hadn't actually personally used it. So I couldn't see the power of what they were talking about and what they were developing. But I certainly feel like I see it now. And I think in pathology in general, I've spent a lot of time thinking about AI at the slide, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's a great use case for it.
Mhm.
And I think that will continue to be a really powerful solution. But we're just now thinking about, well, if we are describing having hardware in place and automation in place in labs that can do this in a hands-free way, what happens when you can now start to make decisions around specimen preparation with AI models and not just basic normal organized orchestration of just sequentially pushing specimens through the lab, right?
Mhm.
I don't exactly that's an area that I'm really fascinated, I think is going to evolve really quick as Formapath, but other companies that are building really cool automation solutions for histology, et cetera, as they come online and these tools can start to talk and connect to each other, it's going to be a whole new opportunity for what's possible in the lab.
Yeah, I agree. Like you said, this stuff is fascinating. I read up on it as much as I can, and I want to use as many of these new products as I can get my hands on. And I tell this to people all the time. Like you said, you don't really know much about AI until you used it. And I keep telling people, just try these things.
Yeah.
They might not be perfect, and maybe they don't do what you want them to do, but this is the beginning.
And you come back 3 months later and it works so much
Yeah,
better. I mean, 1 month later, it's amazing the speed in which this is evolving. And obviously there's concerns and that's a whole separate side of it. But just
sure.
from like a pure technology interest perspective, I mean, it's going hyperspeed
Yeah,
and there's no doubt that it's going to impact how we all work, whether it's us as technology developers from Formapath side, people in the lab, like
right.
this technology is going to find its way into places. And I think it will be done right. And there will be really interesting benefits to both people in the lab and the patient.
Yeah, for sure. And that's right. The patient, that's what it's all about. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you're coming back to the stuff, this is like part of the nToto is you talk to people who are waiting. I mean, this happens all the time with families, right?
Yep.
You're waiting on a
Yep.
diagnosis and the lab is doing the best they can. They are just slammed with specimens. And under normal times, maybe it's a 48-hour, 72-hour turnaround time. But because of staffing issues and all sorts of stuff, routine diagnosis stretches out a week or longer. I mean, we don't want to see it happen, but it does. And that's tough from the patient side, right? You're sitting there wondering what's going on.
Yep.
And if we can use this technology to help alleviate some of the log jams and just help information and specimens keep flowing, even without kind of getting into like the accuracy claims, just time to answer is an important element of a patient experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love talking about this kind of stuff. This is super exciting just to me. Alex, I appreciate you coming on, taking the time to explain the end.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Alex Bodell, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
If you're looking for another episode of the People of Pathology podcast to check out after this one, here's a clip from my interview with Dr. Miriam Sefta and Amanda Coble as we discuss how Oken is using digital pathology and AI to improve precision medicine and biomarker discovery.
So I think that this for pathology is very, very promising. And I mean, what I've seen, at least at my level, is pathologists are always very keen to develop these AI solutions with us, go digital, transform their entire workflows and their entire way of thinking, their specialty with these digital and AI solutions in mind. And I think that the fact that they are so positive on something that is so disruptive to what they've been doing their whole life shows how much they see the potential of this for patients.
Yeah, I definitely see AI as helping, as Rare said, elevate the pathology group, the pathologists, and the care team, right? Again, you're not just the diagnostician now, you're really driving treatment decisions on another level. I'd also kind of argue that in some ways, this is also the survival of pathology. We see a lot of opportunity for automation of tedious tasks.
You can hear more from Amanda Coble and Dr. Miriam Sefta in episode 205. All right, big thanks to Alex Bodell. One thing that really stood out to me is how often innovation comes from people asking simple questions that everyone else has stopped asking. Alex looked at tissue grossing not as something that's always been done by hand, but as a process. And when you look at a process through an engineering lens, you naturally start asking, what parts are repetitive? What parts create bottlenecks? What are the opportunities to improve consistency? That's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to meaningful innovation. What's especially interesting is that Alex didn't set out to work in pathology. He wasn't trying to disrupt our profession. He simply saw a problem that needed solving. Sometimes those fresh perspectives are exactly what move an entire field forward. I'm pretty sure this topic will be a bit controversial. It's natural to have mixed feelings whenever automation enters the conversation, and we've all seen technologies that promised more than they delivered. We also know that pathology isn't just manufacturing. Every specimen is different, every patient is different, and our work requires judgment, experience, and adaptability. But I also think it's important to separate automation from replacement. If robotics can reliably perform repetitive, standardized tasks, especially in high-volume biopsy situations, that doesn't diminish the value of the people in the lab. It allows skilled professionals to focus on the work that truly requires their expertise. Alex talked about this. As specimen volumes continue to rise and staffing shortages persist, we'll probably need every tool available to maintain quality while continuing to deliver timely diagnoses. And that's really the part that I keep coming back to. This isn't ultimately about robots or AI, it's about patients. Every biopsy represents a person waiting for answers, someone waiting to find out whether they have cancer, someone deciding on surgery. If technology can help shorten that wait while maintaining or even improving quality, that's something worth paying attention to. Of course, these technologies will need to earn our trust. They'll need to demonstrate accuracy, reliability, safety, and thoughtful integration into laboratory workflows. Those are conversations our profession should absolutely be having. But they're conversations worth having because the potential impact is so significant. One of the reasons I started this podcast was to learn about new technologies, new ideas, and the people behind them, not only for myself, but for you, the listeners. Because understanding where innovation comes from helps all of us think more broadly about the future of our profession. Whether it's robotics, AI, digital pathology, or something none of us have imagined yet, the future of pathology is going to be shaped by collaborations between engineers, software developers, pathologists, pathologist assistants, histotechnologists, and many others working toward the same goal, improving patient care. As always, I'll have links in the show notes to everything that we talked about today. Don't forget you can follow this show at People of Path on Instagram, or just connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you for continuing to share the show with others. Together, let's inspire the next generation of pathologists and laboratory professionals. This show is a member of Health Podcast Network. Thanks for listening. I'm Dennis Strank, and I'll talk to you next time on the People of Pathology podcast.